Hi, I'm Gary Bolles. I'm the host of Global Skills Day 2021, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Gayathri Butler, who is the Director of Advocates Programs for the Malala Fund based in London, and Haroon Yasin, who is the CEO of the Orenda Project in Pakistan. And our focus today is going to be on the future of learning in general, but specifically about girls' education and why it's so critical in so many countries around the world to have communities that are supporting education for girls and women as one of the greatest possibilities of being able to tap untapped human potential. So Gaia, do me a favor and walk me through why you believe that girls' education is so important, and specifically about the focus of the fund.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you for inviting me for this discussion today. So let me tell you a little bit about Malala Fund, what we do, and you'll understand about the context a bit about girls' education, why we think it's important. So Malala Fund was founded in 2013 to champion every girl's right to 12 years of free, safe, quality education. So that's primary and secondary. And as an organization, we try and focus on this in three specific ways to accomplish the mission. We invest in local education activists. We invest in advocacy to hold leaders accountable to these rights and really focus on amplifying girls' voices. And in working with local activists, we really prioritize those who are driving solutions to barriers to girls' education in their communities. So we work now in 10 countries around the world, and we really focus on countries where girls face the greatest challenges to education. And these girls may be out of school in communities for many different reasons. It could be to do with social norms, gender stereotypes, conflict, natural disasters, lack of education funding, child marriage, or child labor. It's very different depending on the country, but that's the focus of our work.
No, that's wonderful. And so talk a little bit then about the specific work with Haroon's project in Pakistan, and what some of the dynamics of the issues in Pakistan are that need to be addressed to be able to build effective programs for girls' education.
Thank you. Well, you know, the context for girls' education has changed very much, obviously, because of COVID-19, and it continues to reframe the challenge for us. But if I maybe give you a bit of context on how that's changing for girls' education, and then it would be great to hear from Haroon himself about how he's seeking to address these challenges in the specific case of his organization in Pakistan. So maybe I'll invite him with a few questions to share some insights. But before he does that, let me just give you some introductory kind of context for how the work has changed. So since the beginning of the pandemic, we know that almost 90% of the world's countries shut their schools in an effort to slow down the transmission. And for many students in high-income countries, though they have suffered deep and quite difficult disruptions, school closures we know are temporary. During this time, students continue to have access to some degree to quality education, albeit remotely. But we remain confident that their education and their ambitions for the future will continue after the crisis. But for millions of students around the world, particularly girls in low income countries, this isn't really the case. And we've done some research which shows that for the most marginalized girls, COVID-19 will have really lasting effects, and it's actually threatening to reverse the years of progress that we've actually made on global education. So before the pandemic, more than 130 million girls globally were out of school. But now we estimate that through the pandemic, a further 20 million girls in lower income countries may never return to the classroom. So it's a very different experience. Girls in the world's most vulnerable communities struggle to access devices like smartphones or tablets. And it's because of a whole host of economic barriers, but also social barriers, keeping them out of distant learning opportunities. But from our experience, we also know that whether girls and young women are fighting for climate change or racial equality or economic injustice, education best equips them with the skills they need to thrive and to tackle the issues that they see that are affecting their communities. And it's actually local education activists and advocates like Haroon, who we at Malala Fund call education champions. We feel they're best positioned to really identify the most innovative solutions, those that are very context specific, to tackle barriers that girls are facing in their communities, in their countries, and will continue to face in the wake of the pandemic. So I'm really happy Haroon's been able to join us today. He's one of our education champions, and he's a CEO of Orenda, an education tech social enterprise in Pakistan. So maybe I'll invite him to answer a few questions, but before doing so, let me just introduce him a little bit about his work. Leading up to the pandemic, Haroon and his team had been digitizing Pakistan's national curriculum, and they had developed Talimabad, a mobile and web application that helps out-of-school children resume their studies. So when COVID hit, their organization, Orenda, was poised to respond to the increased demand for digital learning resources for children. And they had signed an agreement with the Federal Ministry of Education in Pakistan to broadcast their content on national television as part of the government's teleschool program. So over the last year and a half, Haroon and his team really have learned a lot about the growing demand for digital and hybrid learning, about what works, what are the drawbacks, how to design for the most marginalized. So I'm really excited that he's joined us today, and I think it's best to hear from him a little bit about the insights into the future of learning. But before doing so, Haroon, can I just ask us if you can share, ask you to share a little bit about how COVID-19 has impacted girls and learning in Pakistan specifically?
Thanks, Gaya. In Pakistan, let me set the context for what was in place before the pandemic. There's about 24 million children who are out of school. Then there are about 40 million children who are in school, but really do struggle. And by the time they reach the end of their primary grades, about 48% of the students cannot do a division sum. And a large number of them cannot even read a single sentence in their native language or in English. So children are out of school, and even if they go to school, they're struggling. And on top of that, Pakistan has a huge dip in the number of students who simply leave school after their primary grades. Now, we worked all over Pakistan. In the past 10 years, we've lived in villages, in remote communities. We've been involved in education over there for a longer period of time. And one of the things that we saw was that for girls, quite a lot of the parents didn't see the longer returns on their investment when they sent their girls into classrooms. They were reluctant because the girls could either go and work in the farms or be valuable in-house help. In a lot of the cases, there weren't even schools nearby. So the girls, even though they were really good in studies and their parents were supporting them, they didn't have a school to go to. In some places, by sheer virtue of heroics, in sporadic instances, we saw girls traveling over long distances to get to a school and with their family and their parents supporting them. So you are very right in pointing out that there is absolutely no one narrative that fits why girls aren't in school, and it varies from community to community. But when the pandemic hit, almost immediately, most of the children in Pakistan now were out of school. And with the exception of a very small elite number of schools in the main cities, the rest of them didn't have any digital mechanisms ready to serve their students. And so what ensued in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic was we've seen quite a lot of teachers becoming their students' heroes. In some of the communities where we work, we saw teachers walk to a student's house, to deliver homework and to follow up with the parent. And we talk about digital and APIs and messages, whether they were sent or delivered. And here we were back to the very earliest sort of forms of communication, but it was working for them. The problem that we wanted to get to the bottom of was, how do we build models for this at scale? And I'm going to get to that in a bit. But teachers were creating WhatsApp groups. If parents didn't have WhatsApp on their phones, they were creating SMS lists. They were sending out mass messages to their parents. They tried practically everything under the sun. In some cases, opening up the doors of a mosque where girls are normally not allowed to be, and then gathering all of the girls over there so that they could, just quickly revise what they'd learned before the pandemic closed down all of the schools. Um, but the but that's the hope in some sporadic communities. But if you zoom out and look at the picture at scale, the unfortunate statistics are that a lot of the students in Pakistan who were affected by closures may never ever come back to school. Malala Fund estimates that that figure worldwide is going to be about at 20 million girls. But in Pakistan too, the last time we had school closures in Pakistan was during the earthquake in 2005. And just being out of school without a regular means to communicate with their teachers. In 6 months, by some estimates, the students went back 2 years in their learning. And when that happens, when children are at home, especially for girls, we've begun to hear a lot of stories of girls becoming preoccupied in housework or other tasks. And then parents or girls in some cases don't find it worthwhile to be going back to school because they feel like they've gotten a gap which they can't cover. And that sort of, like you said, may roll back the work that we've been all striving to do. And that's something that, needs to be looked at immediately as COVID draws to a close in many other countries. But we were talking about this the other day. We've got a fourth wave coming, even though at the third wave, everybody said, now the vaccines are here and we're going to be out. And there's a fourth wave expected. And in Pakistan, there's a fifth and sixth one also expected because vaccination rates are simply too slow to reach that critical mass. So whatever strategies we had, the crucial thing is to make sure that the government and everybody else in the ecosystem realizes that this is not a short-term thing. We might as well get used to it because it might be around for the next year or two.
Thanks, Haroon. I mean, it's so interesting, all the creative things that you've seen happening in front of you. In responding to all these closures, I mean, what was your strategy and as an organization, and what's really surprised you in this transition process and kind of in this period?
I think most edtech companies will not sort of get to this realization very easily, but I think that there were cracks in the wall long before COVID hit, which is, when we build edtech products, when we build apps and platforms, and we launch them, what differences we see in their usages over time begins to reflect that platforms naturally gravitate towards cities and main hubs because these are the people who can speak in English. These are the people who can pay for services. This is the kind of sort of mobile platform or edtech company that gets funded by VCs. And so in Pakistan, good quality education was already very, very expensive because only a select group of private schools provided quality that parents thought was worthwhile. And then there was a huge after-school tuition market, which served the needs, or in some cases, according to a lot of people, sort of exploited the fear of the parent, but also had to be paid for. And so what we saw immediately was that a lot of the companies simply stuck to these two things: either providing education at a really high cost that was digital, or providing it in a supplementary fashion, which outpriced the users. And the first thing that we discovered was, even if you don't outprice these users, by virtue of how you go about building your platforms, if it's not built in from the first day, it's simply not going to cut it. And so one of the things we did early on was we've always built our platform in the native language, so as many as students can access it as possible. The other thing that we did was, before the pandemic was approaching, we were coming to a plateau at around 200,000 kids. And this is as many kids as you can find in cities. And so we called up the users who downloaded and deleted, the platform from their phones and from their PCs, and said, what's up? Why aren't you using it? And they said, well, it's too large, it's too chunky. We don't have the good phones that you're willing to build all of these platforms for. So how about you change all of this? And what ensued in the coming months was, this is a good smartphone, but we found ourselves designing for the really tiny feature phones, which about 80% of Pakistan's population has. We found ourselves designing for offline. And we found ourselves going to not only TV but also to radio broadcasters to say how can we build as big of a safety net as possible so that all of these students, especially the girls, can have access to quality learning during the pandemic. And so, you know, we realized during the pandemic that, well, while everybody else had rushed to digital, because we were in the digital space to begin with, we found ourselves rushing in the complete opposite direction. We ended up developing over 36 sort of course books, actual printed material, so that when students were watching on TV, they could simply attempt the notebook and put two and two together. We actually built quite a whole lot of lesson plans. So in the event that the teacher could sort of, the teacher started teaching online or in class, she knew exactly where to pick up from. She knew exactly in this sort of really unpredictable time, we built material that allowed the teacher to dissect where each student's learning levels were, because they'd gone back, some kids had gone back home and their moms had sat down with them and they'd studied, and some kids came back after the first lockdown having not even touched a book. And so we taught them how to engage with students from different levels. And so a huge number of, we always talk about growth hacking in the tech community. How do we build platforms and features that sort of get the most usage out of our users? And I think the pandemic taught us, it's less about growth hacking in terms of this tech platform. It's more about, hacking into communities and sentiments and needs over there. And that led to, we shy away from calling ourselves an ed tech company, because I think we've become an education company overall, because quite a whole lot of the products that got sold and that got used all over the country, the digital was a part of that. But a huge part was going to our customer and saying, look, I don't think we're serving you just the way you want to be served. So what additional things do you need? And when they said, here's what we need, it won't make it's something that is clunky and not scalable, but can you do it? And we did it, and now we're finding ways that that can also be scaled. But for the foreseeable future, even when everybody has a smartphone in their pocket, inclusion is not going to be about making an app. Inclusion is going to be about, on the first day that you start to build that app, what language are you doing this in? What context are you showing the child? Are they having pizzas in all of their videos to show fractions, or are they having, wheat and rice cakes, when they're doing maths? And so I think that has to be built in from the very start and not as an add-on. And that's one of the biggest lessons that we've taken away from the pandemic.
Thanks, Haroon. I mean, I think it's so interesting, and it's something that we've been seeing across our champions, especially those that are involved in education delivery, that COVID-19 is almost, with all the negative, there's also this opportunity for really reframing design and program design and thinking with a designer's mindset. And a certain boundaries start collapsing between digital and physical spaces, student-teacher relationships. Then you start asking all these questions and designing around trying to use technology not to reinforce the marginalization, but actually thinking it through, and actually how can we tackle the marginalization by creating new modes of delivery using digital and physical methods. And I think this is such a perfect example of that. And you know, constantly questioning and then even thinking through content and what that would look like with a designer's mindset. It's brilliant. The third question, how's what you've experienced and learned over the past year and a half impacted how you see the general future of learning? What do you think it means for students, for the organizations, the schools that serve them?
I think we were just replying to a text message that came from a student uh, in one of the most remote communities in Pakistan, and we weren't expecting this text message. 4 or 5 year olds aren't supposed to know how to text. How did they get access to a device and text us? But more importantly, some siblings had gotten together. They had used their mom's phone off and on at 11:30 p.m. in the night. By the way, that was their most recurring time, and they'd sent a text message and they were talking about why on earth everybody's forgotten about summer vacations when the pandemic hit. And we said, well, yeah, we've come into this space so much that digital now remains on all the time, and you must have felt it when you're getting messages on Teams and Slack and at 11 p.m. in the night, and you're responding to them because the boundaries between work and and personal are being blurred. And here was a student who had never been on digital before, but who was using digital to say, you've blurred my boundaries too. And you need to go back a little bit because this is my summer vacation and nobody's thinking about it. What it is going to look like in the future is that students are getting used to digital. Um, One of the most interesting things that we've seen is that Talimabad used to be, we always used to wonder if this was an add-on that parents were only giving to their children when they were done using their phones, because there's only one phone in the family and the dad owns that phone in most Pakistani households. And so children would use the app the most at 11:30 p.m. at night. And we said, well, that's not right. There's clearly something happening because the kid is getting access to it very late. And when are they sleeping if they're up early in the morning too? And so we went back to our users and we said, well, who's making all of these decisions? And the mom said, well, I didn't know when they were using and what they were doing. And that is when we figured out that when we're going to build a product, it's going to be an ecosystem which serves everybody involved in that ecosystem. Research shows that if parents are involved in a child's education, the chances of them dropping out or lagging behind in school are even lower. And so we started this entire campaign targeting mothers and saying, here's how you sit down with your child. Here's what you ask him if or her when they come back from school. And here's when you open the app, here's what you talk to your child when you're using it. And so almost the mom became a facilitator of the product. And one of the things that we began to see was that Talimabad's times began to shift, and the most recurring times became 2 to 3 p.m. The child would be fresh, they would come back home, have lunch, and then the mom would say, well, do you want to watch some cartoons around what you've just seen in school? And what that is expounding, that trend is that digital will continue. The fourth lockdown is close to, it's arriving in Pakistan, and already we're hearing from parents and students saying, all right, which section of the app do we go on? And which module are we covering this time around? And so it's becoming a hardwired habit that people are keeping in, which we're happy to see. But at the same time, we do think that there are a couple of things that will need to be looked into. First, we talked about students losing blurring the lines between study and play. More importantly, that's what they're asking. We don't want to be doing that, even if it's the most attractive, animated, addictive education in the world. The other thing is that parents are going to be a very important part of the puzzle. And while we design around parents, we've also got to be thinking about the mom who's got to wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning, go feed the cattle, go work in the fields, come back and wash the clothes, and make food again. And so we've also got to be figuring out how we don't want to put this additional responsibility on their shoulders. And now we're also thinking about engaging the elder siblings or the elder family members of the maybe the grandparents or somebody who can take on the shoulder and engage the children beyond that when they're in at home or in lockdown. But the last bit is that hopefully we'll see a day when COVID is gone. And when that day comes, one of the greatest achievements would be that we would have become completely comfortable in a hybrid setting. That parents would have gotten more involved. They would know what their child is studying. They would have seen that now they can also educate their child via TV or radio or their mobile phone, and would be using that in even greater capacity. Uh, and teachers would be well supported in schools too, because a huge number of schools in Pakistan has shut down. They're gone. Low cost private schools couldn't pay their rents and they're out of the market. And so now government schools and public schools and other schools are likely to get more crowded. And when imagine students with lackluster learning levels or regressed learning levels, and then new students and dropped out students, teachers are going to be in the middle of a storm when this sort of eases. And so we also want to make sure that we bring these students in for a smooth landing, and hybrid is going to be a key part of that. One of the reports that we're preparing for our teachers is, when students come back, we will tell them historically how their students were performing on the platform and say, look, your kid didn't get the second part of fractions when fractions become unequal. How about we look into that and you don't worry about the rest? And so this is what will work in the future according to us. It's got to be an ecosystem approach. Digital and physical are both likely to coexist, and then new actors in the ecosystem who will likely make the education experience much more better. And all of these three will contribute to what we hope. I mean, it's going to be challenging times because of the circumstances we just talked about. But there is hope that this is causing a fundamental shift in how students learn at the bottom of the pyramid.
Thanks, Haroon. Gary, I opened it with saying that we invest in education activists, local education activists, because they're best placed to understand innovation and context in terms of tackling girls' education in their community. And I think, Haroon, you're such a good example of this, because even that insight, really thinking through, now we've seen COVID really raise the lid on kind of education being a challenge for the community. All are involved, parents particularly. Really, as a parent myself, I know that now from homeschooling, the real visibility of the relationship between student, teacher, parent, but you're designing very much in terms of what that means in your community. And I think that's a really important principle for kind of good program design, and can see already gaining real success for you. So thank you very much for answering these questions and sharing your insights with us.
No, thanks to you both. That was really amazing. I think this is a tremendous example of the kind of partnership that we like to highlight as much as possible to help people understand what Malala Fund brings. Obviously, is a broader landscape and context, looking at the data that you're talking about, so you can aggregate and show people just how big the challenge is. And then the opportunity, obviously, is to be able to help to support the in-country entrepreneurs like Haroon, who actually understand the lived experience of the populations that they're dealing with. And so some of my quick takeaways were, I think your label, Gaia, was perfect with reframing design. So you're understanding deeply the lived experience of the students, but then using a range of different tools and contexts to be able to provide the services that they need. Haroon, I heard you have a relentless focus on scale, but you're doing it through hacking community engagement. It's not just the next app that can be used on a range of different phones. It's because you have to be able to drive engagement at the community level. The community has to be all in on trying to support these kinds of initiatives, and the parents, obviously, especially, need to be part of the process. But what I also heard, Haroon, was just continuous adaptation as you learned about what works. You had some thesis, and then you hit some barriers. You had 200,000 students, and then, now here's the thing we need to do to move beyond that. And so I think all of these are tremendous takeaways for others who are looking for ways to be able to try to have this kind of impact at scale. But if there's anything I've taken away, it's just how important the work that you're doing is, and especially because in so many countries, it's access to great education, and especially for young girls, that is one of the most significant barriers to building a better future. So thanks to both of you. I hope that all of our attendees for Global Skills Day will be as inspired by this as I have been. Take care and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.